She was adjusting a boutonniere when she realized the most dangerous man in Atlanta was about to walk straight into his own funeral. Marilyn Flores didn't stop moving, didn't blink, didn't let the smile leave her face. That was the thing about running events for people who buried problems instead of solving them. You learned, very fast, how to keep your hands busy while your mind was already 3 steps ahead of a catastrophe. She straightened So-Yeon's white tuxedo lapel with the same calm, practiced precision she used on every client. Crisp black bow tie, immaculate jacket, intricate tattoos climbing his neck like a map of every war he'd ever won. She'd worked with dangerous men before. That part didn't scare her. What scared her was the bridal suite, specifically as the vanity mirror in the bridal suite. Specifically, the reflection of a bride standing perfectly still in a white lace gown with an open back. Specifically, the small black transmitter taped to the bride's bare spine, its red light blinking once, twice, steady as a heartbeat. Patient as a countdown. Marilyn had seen it 4 minutes ago. She had spent those 4 minutes deciding whether it was her problem. It wasn't. It had never been. Her rule, the one rule that had kept her alive and in business for 6 years, was simple. Mind the flowers, ignore the felonies. She planned the event. She cashed the check. Whatever happened after the last guest left was not her story to carry. But whoever was on the other end of that wire wasn't waiting for the last guest to leave. They were waiting for the altar. Now, before we go any further, if you've ever walked into a room, clocked something that wasn't your business, and felt that cold, quiet voice in your chest whispering, "Say something," or walk away and let it burn, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Because Marilyn Flores was not a hero. She was a businesswoman, a brilliant, meticulous, emotionally locked-down businesswoman who had built her entire life around the art of not getting involved. And in about 60 seconds, she was going to lean into the ear of the most feared man in the city and blow up everything she'd spent years protecting. Before we start, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything. Let me know in the comments, would you have said something, or would you have walked away? It truly means a lot to see our storytelling community growing the way it has been. On every like, comment, and share you leave helps us reach more people who love stories like this, and I'm so grateful we get to build this world together. Now, let's go back to that boutonniere. The flowers arrived at 6:14 in the morning, and Marilyn Flores was already there to receive them. She stood at the service entrance of the Grandeur Pavilion, Atlanta's most obscenely expensive private event venue, tucked behind iron gates in Buckhead like a secret someone had poured $60 million into keeping, and she watched 12 men carry in 1,700 white peonies, 200 stems of garden roses, and enough Italian ruscas to fill a greenhouse. She had her clipboard. She had her earpiece. She had her coffee, black, no sugar, still too hot to drink, and she didn't care because she wasn't drinking it for the taste. She was drinking it because it gave her hands something to hold while she counted. She counted everything. That was the job. That was the whole job, distilled down to its cleanest, most honest form. Count everything. Control everything. And when something is wrong, fix it before anyone notices it was ever broken. That's 16 crates, not 17, she said. The delivery lead, a heavy-set man sweating through his uniform at 6 a.m. in March, looked at his manifest, looked at her, looked back at the manifest. "Ma'am, I've got 17 listed right. Crate 9 is missing the garden roses. You have it logged, but it's not on the truck." She hadn't moved from her spot. She hadn't checked a single box. "Call your warehouse. You've got 40 minutes before the florist team needs to begin installation. And I need those stems in water in the next 20 or the entire East Wing arrangement is going to peak 2 hours too early and look tired by the ceremony." She finally took a sip of her coffee. 40 minutes. He called the warehouse. The missing crate arrived in 31. That was Marilyn Flores. That was 6 years of building a business that other people called impossible. A boutique event planning firm that catered to clients who didn't advertise, didn't give interviews, and settled disputes in ways that didn't involve litigation. She had stumbled into this world by accident, the way most people stumble into the things that define them. One unusual client, one referral whispered in a private room, one job that paid triple her normal rate and required her to ask exactly 0 questions. She had been good at the asking 0 questions part. She had been extraordinary at the everything else part. And word had traveled the way word always travels in closed circles, fast and quiet and impossible to stop. Now she planned weddings for men whose groomsmen had visible earpieces and invisible weapons. She organized anniversaries for women who moved through rooms like they owned the air inside them. She built beautiful, flawless, magazine-worthy events around people who would never appear in any magazine, and she did it with the same detached perfection she applied to everything in her life. Mind the flowers. Ignore the felonies. That was the rule. The only rule that mattered. Tonight's event was the largest of her career. 240 guests. A ceremony in the grand hall, a reception in the ballroom, a dinner catered by a team she'd flown in from New York because Atlanta's best caterers had a habit of talking, and her clients had a habit of minding who talked. The budget was the kind of number she didn't say out loud in public. The client was the kind of man she didn't describe in detail to anyone. His name was So-Yun. She had heard it for the first time 8 months ago, spoken quietly by a man in a very expensive suit who had walked into her office without an appointment and sat down without being invited and slid a folder across her desk without explanation. Inside the folder, a date, a venue, a guest count, a budget, and a single line of instruction that read, "Absolute discretion is the only non-negotiable." She had looked up from the folder. The man in the suit had said, "Mr. So-Yun's people are aware of your reputation. Mao, he selected you personally." She had thought about her lease, the corporate event planning firm that had been sniffing around her client list for the better part of a year, making offers to poach her vendors, quietly building a case to absorb or bury her independent operation. She had thought about the number on the inside of the folder, which was large enough to remove every financial threat on her horizon for the next 3 years. She had said, "I'll need full venue access 48 hours before the event." She had gotten 36. She had made it work. Now it was 7 hours to ceremony, and she was walking the grand hall with her site manager, Marcus, a lanky 26-year-old who had the spatial memory of an architect and the social anxiety of someone who had made a terrible career choice by entering the events industry. He was good at the logistics. He was terrible at the clients. "The East Wing altar installation is about 60%, he told her, matching her pace with his tablet clutched to his chest. "Lighting rig is set, but the tech crew wants a second run-through on the ceremony cue sequence. Schedule it for 11. That gives us a buffer before the wedding party arrives at 1. She paused at the entrance to the grand hall, looking down the length of the room. 1,700 peonies. Ivory draping that cost more per yard than most people's rent. An altar built from reclaimed white oak with gold inlay, flanked by cascading floral columns that her design team had been assembling since 4 in the morning. It was, even half-finished, the most beautiful room she had ever built. She felt exactly nothing about it, which was how she knew it was good. Emotion was not part of the job. Emotion was what happened to planners who got attached to the aesthetic and stopped watching the logistics. She had learned that early, and she had built her entire professional identity around the absence of it. The flowers were variables. The timeline was a system. The guests were moving pieces in a sequence that she controlled from the moment they arrived until the moment they left. "What's the security configuration?" she asked. Marcus consulted his tablet. 12-man team on the perimeter, 4 inside the hall during the ceremony, 6 at reception entry points. Mr. So-Yun's personal team is managing internal positioning. They didn't share the grid with us. They never did. That was fine. She didn't need their grid. She had walked every inch of this building 3 times in the last 36 hours. She knew where every door led, every service corridor ran, every electrical panel was mounted. She knew the building the way she knew every building she worked in, completely, quietly, and without anyone asking why. "And the groom?" she asked. "Arrived 20 minutes ago. Green room on the east side." Marcus paused. He didn't come alone. He never does. She turned from the hall and walked toward the east corridor. She smelled the tension before she saw him. That was the only way she could describe it. There was a quality in the air near So-yeon that changed the atmosphere of whatever room he occupied, the way barometric pressure drops before a storm. The men standing outside the green room door felt it too. She could tell by the way they held themselves, spine straight, hands quiet, eyes tracking everything. 4 of them flanking a single door. She walked toward it without breaking stride, and one of them stepped forward and she held up her event credentials without looking at him, and he stepped back. She pushed the door open. So-yeon was standing at the window. She had seen photographs. She had done her due diligence before taking any client, enough to understand the nature of the world they moved in, enough to know what questions not to ask. But photographs had not prepared her for the particular quality of stillness he possessed. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the pavilion grounds, and he didn't turn when she entered. The white tuxedo jacket was immaculate, fitted to him like it had been constructed directly on his body. The black bow tie was already in place, and the tattoos, the ones that climbed from somewhere beneath the jacket collar to cover his neck in dense, intricate patterns that spread across the backs of his hands and down his fingers, were not incidental details. They were architecture. They were a record of something long and violent and entirely his own. She had worked with powerful men before. She had planned events for people who moved markets and broke things and built things and owned things. None of them had felt like this. So-yeon didn't project power the way powerful men usually did, loudly, visibly, with the constant low-grade performance of dominance. He contained it. He kept it still. That was what made the room feel different. Not the threat of what he might do, but the absolute certainty that whatever he decided, it was already decided, and the world was simply waiting to catch up. Mr. So-yeon. Her voice was even, professional. Marilyn Flores, event lead. I'm here to walk you through the ceremony timeline and confirm your preferences for the processional sequence. He turned from the window. His eyes were dark and entirely calm, and they moved over her with the same quality of assessment she used on rooms. Quick, total, nothing missed. The flowers, he said. His English was precise, each word given its full weight. The East Wing. They're different from the rendering. She didn't blink. The original garden rose variety had a color variance in the delivered stock. I substituted a complementary stem that maintains the tonal palette. The visual effect at the altar is unchanged. A pause. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. You noticed before installation. I notice everything before it becomes a problem. She clicked the top of her pen. That's what you're paying for. He looked at her for one more moment, that same still measuring look, and then he turned back to the window. Walk me through the timeline. She walked him through it. Processional at 3, ceremony approximately 22 minutes, recession to the antechamber while the hall transitioned to reception layout, cocktail hour in the west atrium, ballroom doors open at 5. She was precise and detailed, and she watched him absorb information the way intelligent, dangerous people absorb information. Without writing anything down, without asking her to repeat herself, with a quality of attention that told her he would remember every word exactly as she said it. When she finished, he said, My bride will arrive at 1. I'll be in the bridal suite. Ensure she has everything she needs. Of course. She turned to leave. Ms. Flores. She stopped. This event represents something larger than a wedding. He was still facing the window. The people in that room tonight are watching. Every detail communicates something. Understand that. I always understand that, she said. Every event I plan communicates something. Tonight's will communicate perfection. She paused, one hand on the doorframe. That's also what you're paying for. She left before he could respond, and she did not let herself think about the weight of what he'd said until she was halfway down the corridor. And by then she had already filed it in the same place she filed everything that wasn't directly actionable. Mind the flowers, ignore the felonies. 7 hours. She had a wedding to build. The bride's name was Ji-ho, and she arrived at exactly 1 o'clock in a black SUV with tinted windows and 2 women who Marilyn understood immediately were not bridesmaids. They had the stillness, the same quality of contained readiness that Soyeon's men carried. They smiled at the appropriate moments and held garment bags and spoke in warm, soft voices, and their eyes never stopped moving. Marilyn noted it, filed it, and showed them to the bridal suite. The suite was on the 2nd floor of the pavilion's residential wing, a room that Marilyn had transformed in the early morning hours from a standard luxury space into something worthy of the occasion. Champagne in a crystal bucket, white roses in 3 separate arrangements scaled to the room's sightlines, a full-length antique mirror framed in gold leaf, positioned to catch the light from the east-facing windows. The vanity lit from 3 angles, no shadows, everything warm and flattering and deliberately, carefully perfect. Ji-ho walked in and looked around and said nothing. She was beautiful in the specific way that very composed people are beautiful, every element of her appearance deliberate, controlled, arranged. Dark hair pinned into an elegant low style beneath a pearl headpiece that caught the light when she moved. With skin like cooled porcelain, an expression of perfect absolute serenity that Marilyn recognized as the face of someone who was very, very good at wearing faces. The gown was already on the dress form by the window. White lace, floor-length, deeply open at the back, a design that required its own structural undergarment and left the entire expanse of Ji-ho's spine bare from the base of her neck to the small of her back. It was extraordinary workmanship. Marilyn had sourced it personally, arranged its transport, ensured it arrived without a crease. She helped Ji-ho into it. This was part of the job, being present, being useful, being invisible. She worked the back closures with practiced hands while the 2 non-bridesmaids arranged Ji-ho's train and the room filled with the quiet sounds of preparation. Hairpins. The soft exhale of fabric settling into place. The faint sound of music from the ceremony rehearsal drifting up from the floor below. "The veil," Marilyn said to the room, and one of the women brought it. She moved Ji-ho gently toward the vanity. This was the standard choreography of every bridal preparation she'd ever managed. The final positioning in front of the mirror, the placement of the veil, the moment the bride saw herself assembled and complete. It was the only part of the job where Marilyn had ever felt anything close to sentiment, and even then, it was brief and efficiently suppressed. She stood behind Ji-ho at the vanity and lifted the veil, and that was when she saw it. The mirror gave it to her directly, the way mirrors give you things you were never meant to see. In reflection, in the unguarded background of someone else's image, Ji-ho was looking at her own face. The 2 women were moving behind them, adjusting the train. And framed perfectly in the gold mirror, in the clean white landscape of Ji-ho's exposed back, was a small black device no larger than a matchbook, taped flat against the curve of her lower spine with surgical precision. Its red light blinked once, twice, steady, patient, a heartbeat counting down to something. Marilyn placed the veil. Her hands did not shake. Her face did not change. She made the micro-adjustment to the headpiece with the same small, concentrated movements she always used, and she stepped back and said, "Beautiful," in the same warm, neutral tone she used for every bride, and Ji-ho smiled at her reflection, and Marilyn smiled back. And then Marilyn turned away and picked up her clipboard and walked to the window and looked at the grounds below and spent exactly 45 seconds deciding what to do. The device was not an FBI wire. She had seen federal surveillance equipment used at 2 previous events. Word got around in her world. And federal equipment had a profile, a way of being installed that prioritized concealment over everything. This was concealed, yes, but it was also positioned for range, for transmission, for the sustained broadcast of everything within a room's acoustic radius, not just the immediate vicinity of the person wearing it. It was not recording evidence. It was feeding a live signal to someone waiting for a specific sound. The most specific sound at a wedding, if you were waiting for a man to lower his guard completely, was a set of vows. She thought about the two women who were not bridesmaids. She thought about the way they'd entered the room with their eyes already moving. She thought about what So-yeon had said. This event represents something larger than a wedding. And she thought about the guest list she'd memorized because she memorized every guest list. And she thought about the specific composition of that list, which read like a deliberate gathering of opposing powers arranged in formal proximity. A peace treaty, someone had told her months ago. A marriage between syndicates. An arrangement meant to hold something together that would otherwise tear apart violently. She stared at the grounds below. Mind the flowers, she told herself. Mind the flowers and get paid and go home and let this world solve its own problems the way it always has, which is badly and with consequences that are none of your concern. The red light blinked in the mirror behind her. She thought about the number in the folder. She thought about her lease. She thought about 3 years of financial security sitting at the end of tonight, contingent on the event going perfectly, contingent on the groom being alive at the end of the reception. She picked up her clipboard. She walked out of the bridal suite. She found So-yeon in the antechamber adjacent to the grand hall, 22 minutes before the processional. He was standing with 3 of his men, all of them in matching black suits that did nothing to disguise the fact that they were men who had broken things and would break things again. The conversation stopped when Marilyn entered. Every set of eyes in the room turned to her. She didn't look at the men. She looked at So-yeon, and she kept her face neutral and professional and completely unhurried, and she walked directly to him and lifted her hands toward his lapel, the universal body language of a wedding coordinator making a last-minute adjustment, and she leaned in close enough to keep her voice inside the 3 inches of air between his ear and her mouth. "Don't react," she said. She felt the slight change in his breathing. Nothing else moved. The bride is wired. She smoothed the edge of his boutonniere with 2 fingers and kept her eyes on his lapel, not his face. Small black transmitter, low back taped to the spine. It's live. Someone is listening to everything in that hall tonight and they are waiting for a signal. She paused 1 beat. "I don't think it's the authorities." She stepped back. She pulled a small pin from her kit and adjusted the boutonniere's angle by 4 degrees, which was completely unnecessary and absolutely necessary. She still wasn't looking at his face. Then she did. She had told herself that she was ready for his reaction, that she had accounted for the variables, that she knew this man processed information differently from other men and would not shout or grab her arm or do anything that the people watching from the hall's entrance could read as disruption. She had been right about all of that. What she had not accounted for was the specific quality of the look he gave her. It moved through several things in the space of about 3 seconds. Shock, the kind that arrives not as surprise but as a cold recognition of something already feared. Then a rapid, brutal reassessment of everything he knew. Then something that resolved itself into an absolute stillness that was more frightening than either of the first 2. His tattooed hands came up slowly to his lapels, fingers pressing flat against the white jacket, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her that morning, completely, thoroughly, missing nothing. "You're certain," he said. Not a question, barely above a breath. "I saw it in the mirror. Device is approximately—" "I know what it is." His voice was the same as it had always been, quiet, weighted, precise. The controlled stillness had returned. Whatever storm had moved through him in those 3 seconds was gone, locked behind something impenetrable. He looked past her for a moment, at the wall, at something she couldn't see. Then he looked back. "The ceremony proceeds." She had expected this. She had even agreed with it, on the logic. Pulling out now, with 240 guests assembling in the next room and Jiho's handlers stationed at every exit, was not an exit strategy. It was a detonation. "If we proceed," she said carefully, "whoever is listening will be waiting for a prearranged signal, a word, a sound, a scheduled moment." "The cake cutting," he said quietly. She stared at him. There was a discussion. His jaw was tight. "A scheduled moment in the reception. I was told it was ceremonial. I was told it was tradition. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, but the cold, specific anger of a man who does not forgive deception. It was marked. I understand now why it was marked. The cake cutting. She had it scheduled for 6:45, 2 hours into the reception. I need to stay close to you tonight, she said. Yes. He said it before she finished. You will stay in the wings during the ceremony. You will be at the reception. You will not leave the building without my knowledge. He paused. Can you change the schedule? I can stall, buy you 40 minutes on the reception, maybe an hour if I engineer the right delays. She was already running it. The cocktail hour extended, the first course delayed, the music programmed to hold the room's attention between transitions. I'll need to communicate through my earpiece without it being noticeable. You've been doing that all day, he said. She almost smiled. That's also what you're paying for. For one moment, one strange and suspended moment in the antechamber with the sound of 240 people assembling on the other side of the wall, he looked at her with something that wasn't professional assessment and wasn't gratitude and wasn't any of the things she could neatly categorize and file away. It was something closer to recognition, like he had looked at her and found something unexpected and was still deciding what to do with it. Then it was gone. The still, contained, impenetrable So-yeon returned, and he straightened his lapel, the one she had just adjusted, and looked toward the hall. Miss Flores. Yes, after tonight. A pause. We'll discuss terms. She didn't ask what terms. She nodded once, turned on her heel, pressed her earpiece, and said quietly, Marcus, push the processional pre-show by 8 minutes. Tell the string quartet we're doing a full second pass on the prelude. Don't explain why. And then she walked back toward the grand hall, past the men in black suits who watched her go, and she did not look back, and she did not allow herself to feel anything about the last 4 minutes except the clean, cold clarity of a problem defined and a plan begun. The processional music started at 3:08, 8 minutes late, which no one in the hall seemed to notice because Marilyn had staged the delay with the quiet efficiency of someone rearranging furniture in a room while its occupants were looking out the window. An extended musical prelude, a carefully engineered pause for the seating of 2 late-arriving guests who had not, in fact, arrived late. Marcus had simply held them in the antechamber and released them at her signal, giving the string quartet reason to loop back to the opening movement and giving So-yeon 8 additional minutes she had pulled out of nothing. 8 minutes that she used to change the reception schedule in her headset, adjust the caterer's first course timing, push the cocktail hour extension by 30 minutes, and reroute 2 of the serving staff to positions that gave her better lines of sight to every hall exit. She stood in the wings at the east side of the grand hall's entrance, clipboard in hand, and she watched the world she had built move forward. The hall was extraordinary, 1,700 peonies at their absolute peak, exactly as planned. The ivory draping moved in the subtle air circulation from the venue's climate system in a way that was almost living. The lighting rig delivered what she had specified: warm, undirectional, flattering without being theatrical, the kind of light that makes human beings look like the best version of themselves. 240 people in their seats, in their finest, arranged in a configuration that Marilyn had designed for visual impact and flow. She watched them and she thought, every single person in this room might be in danger tonight, and not one of them knows it. And keeping them unaware is the only thing standing between a perfect wedding and a catastrophe. The groomsmen walked the aisle first, 8 of them, all So-yeon's men, all wearing the same contained readiness behind their formal jackets. Then So-yeon. He appeared at the hall entrance, and the room shifted the way rooms shift when someone walks in who reorganizes the atmosphere. A collective, unconscious adjustment, every head turning, at every spine straightening. He walked down the aisle with the same quality of stillness he carried everywhere, unhurried, absolute, his white tuxedo jacket immaculate, his tattooed hands clasped in front of him, his face utterly composed. The string quartet played something beautiful. He didn't hear it. Or if he did, he gave it nothing. Halfway down the aisle, his eyes found her. She was standing in the east wing, half in shadow, clipboard at her side, earpiece in, entirely functional, entirely professional. His gaze moved across the room and landed on her with the same quality of precision with which he did everything, and held there for exactly 3 steps before he looked forward again. She looked down at her clipboard. The bridal procession followed. Jiho appeared at the entrance in the white lace gown, serene and composed and devastating in her beauty, and the room exhaled the way rooms do for brides, that collective soft release of something like wonder. She walked down the aisle on the arm of a man whose relationship to her Marilyn had not been briefed on and had not asked about. Her pearl headpiece caught the light Marilyn had positioned for exactly this moment. Her veil moved perfectly. Somewhere on her lower back, beneath the lace, a red light blinked in the dark. The officiant was a man Marilyn had sourced and briefed and background checked, a semi-retired judge named Harwell who had performed discreet ceremonies for discreet clients for 30 years and understood that his role was to be precise, warm, and brief. He was all 3. She stood in the wings and she listened to the ceremony through the acoustic space of the hall and through the ambient feed in her earpiece simultaneously, and she did 2 things at once the entire time. She managed the operational continuity of the event with half her attention, and with the other half she listened. Not to the vows, to the static. It had started in the antechamber, a frequency in her earpiece that she'd initially attributed to interference from the venue's audio system, a low, persistent hiss beneath the operational chatter. But in the silence of the ceremony, with her earpiece calibrated to the hall's sound frequencies, the hiss resolved itself into something else. Not static, breathing. The specific rhythmic breathing of people maintaining radio silence, listening to an open channel, waiting. She kept her face entirely still. There were at minimum 3 of them, possibly 4. Their discipline was good. They weren't talking, weren't giving her language to work with, but the texture of their breathing told her they were close, inside the building or just outside its perimeter. The frequency they were using was close enough to her operational band to bleed through, which meant their equipment wasn't military grade, which meant they were confident, not technically superior. She pressed 2 fingers to her earpiece as if checking her own feed and tilted her head slightly and listened harder. At the altar, So-yeon was saying something. His voice was low and deliberate, and she caught only fragments, the words the judge fed him, repeated back with the same precise weight he gave everything. Beside him, Jiho stood with her hands in his, her face turned up toward his with an expression of perfect, radiant stillness that was the best performance Marilyn had ever witnessed. And she had witnessed many. So-yeon's eyes found her again. It happened twice during the vow exchange, a glance, each time brief enough to be invisible to anyone not watching for it, each time landing on her in the wings with a quality of intention that she felt across the entire length of the hall. She didn't know what he was communicating. She wasn't certain he was communicating anything. She knew only that he was doing what she was doing, managing 2 realities simultaneously, the surface reality, which was a wedding, and the other one, which was a countdown. She pressed her fingers to her earpiece again. In the static, between 2 slow, patient breaths, she heard one word, low, clipped, almost swallowed. A voice speaking to someone she couldn't hear, keeping its transmission to the minimum necessary. The word was confirmed. Her hand tightened on her clipboard. She looked at the altar where the officiant was concluding the vow sequence, moving toward the ring exchange, which meant they were approximately 4 minutes from the final pronouncement and approximately 90 minutes from the cake cutting, which she now understood with complete certainty was not a scheduled moment in a reception. It was a clock. Someone had put a time on So-yeon's life and called it a tradition, and in 90 minutes that clock was going to reach 0. She needed to stall it. She needed to buy time. She needed to do both of these things while standing in the wing of a grand hall full of people who were completely unaware that the beautiful wedding around them was a carefully constructed kill box. She tapped her earpiece twice, the signal she used with Marcus for a non-urgent timeline adjustment, and leaned slightly toward the wall's acoustic shadow and said very quietly, "Push the cocktail hour by 30. Tell the kitchen first course is delayed for a dietary accommodation. Use the champagne toast as a buffer." She paused, "and move the cake ceremony to 7:15. A pause on Marcus's end, then, "That's a 30-minute push from the—" "I know what it is. Make it work." The officiant said, "I now pronounce you." And the hall filled with the sound of 240 people exhaling. And the string quartet moved into the recession piece, and Jiho turned toward So-yeon with a smile that was perfect and empty and cold as winter water. So-yeon looked at her, at his new wife. His face was a wall. His eyes were a closed room. He offered her his arm and she took it, and they turned together toward the hall. And as they walked the recession past the east wing, his eyes moved, not to the crowd, not to the doors ahead, not to the men flanking the exits, to Marilyn. One look, 3 steps, then forward. She watched him go and she kept her hand flat against her clipboard and she thought, 90 minutes. She had turned it into 2 hours. It wasn't enough, but it was what she had, and she had built everything in her life out of exactly what she had, and she was not going to stop now. She pressed her earpiece and said, "Marcus, I need the full venue blueprint on my tablet in the next 5 minutes. Service corridors, electrical panels, loading access, everything." "That's a weird request for cocktail hour," Marcus said. "Most of my requests are weird," she said. 5 minutes. She turned from the hall and walked toward the reception, and she did not look at the flowers, and she did not ignore the felonies, and somewhere in the space between those two things, she understood that her golden rule had died in a bridal suite mirror, and whatever came next was something she was going to have to build from scratch. She had always been good at that. The cocktail hour was beautiful. Of course it was. Marilyn had designed it to be beautiful, the way she designed everything, deliberately, completely, with no detail left to chance. The west atrium glowed with candlelight, and the warm spill of the pendant fixtures she'd had re-hung at 7 feet instead of 9, because 9 felt ballroom, and this room needed to feel intimate. The champagne was cold. The past appetizers were precise. The string quartet had transitioned to a jazz configuration, 3 players now, the sound loose and warm and exactly calibrated to the room's acoustics. 240 people moved through it like they owned the air. Marilyn stood at the atrium's east edge with her tablet and her earpiece and her coffee, a fresh one, still too hot, still not the point, and she watched the room and she listened to the static. It had grown. Not louder, exactly. Denser. The way a storm grows not in sound but in pressure, in the quality of the air before it breaks. The breathing in the frequency had multiplied. She could distinguish at minimum 4 individual rhythms now, each separate and disciplined, each positioned in a way that told her they were not together in one location. They were distributed, staged around the building's perimeter and possibly inside it, waiting at pre-assigned positions for a signal that was now scheduled to arrive in, she checked her watch, 1 hour and 43 minutes. She had bought that time with a dietary accommodation fiction and 30 extra minutes of cocktail chatter. She needed to buy more. She needed to buy enough time to do the thing she and So-yeon had not yet had a single private moment to discuss. How to get 240 people out of a building that a kill team had already framed as a box. Her tablet lit up with the venue blueprint Marcus had sent. She opened it. The grandeur pavilion was, in the language of architecture, a converted estate. Original structure mid-19th century, expanded twice in the 1990s, modernized throughout but built on bones that predated the concept of streamlined egress, which meant it had what modern builds never had, redundancy. Service corridors that ran parallel to the public halls because the original structure had been built by people who understood that the work of maintaining a great house should be invisible to the people living in it. A loading dock on the north face that connected via freight corridor to the kitchen, and from the kitchen to a service elevator that accessed every floor independently of the main atrium. A basement mechanical level that most people in the building tonight had never seen and never would. She had seen it. She had walked it. She had noted the panel locations and the corridor widths and the elevator capacity and the distance from the service elevator landing to the north loading dock, where if she made one phone call right now, she could have 3 vehicles staged and ready within 45 minutes. She opened a new channel in her earpiece and made the phone call. The man who answered was her logistics contact, a quiet, efficient person she had used for 6 years for situations that required discretion and vehicles and no questions. She gave him the address, the dock location, the timeline, and 3 words at the end that she had never said to him before in 6 years of working together. Assume hostile environment. A pause on his end. Then, how many passengers? She thought about So-yeon's men, 8 groomsmen, each of whom she now understood was positioned in the reception space, not for ceremony but for exactly this kind of contingency. Plus So-yeon, plus herself, if she was being honest about how tonight ended. 10, she said, possibly 12. 40 minutes. Make it 35. She closed the channel and looked back at the atrium and found So-yeon across the room. He was standing with a cluster of guests, receiving congratulations with the gracious, contained composure of a man who had spent decades being watched and had mastered the performance of normalcy under surveillance. His new wife was at his side, her hand on his arm, her face still radiant and still empty. One of Jiho's non-bridesmaids was stationed 4 feet to her left, my champagne glass untouched. So-yeon's eyes moved across the room in a slow, methodical sweep that no one watching him would have read as anything but the comfortable survey of a man at his own event. They found Marilyn. She gave him the smallest possible nod, not the professional nod she used for timeline confirmations, but a different one. A nod that said, I have something. I need you. Soon. He processed it in the space of a single breath and looked back at his guests. The static broke 40 minutes into the cocktail hour. She was walking the perimeter of the atrium, tablet in hand, performing the visible choreography of an event planner making rounds, when the frequency in her earpiece shifted. The patient breathing, 4 rhythms, disciplined, distributed, went suddenly active. A burst of compressed communication, us voices overlapping, too fast and too low for her to parse individual words, and then a single voice cutting through with the authority of a countdown coordinator. She stopped walking. She pressed 2 fingers to her earpiece and angled her body toward the wall and closed her eyes for 3 seconds and listened with her entire body. The voice said, position check, confirm on my mark. One by one, 4 responses, short, clipped, each one a number, the positions. She didn't have their grid, but she had her blueprint and she had been walking this building for 36 hours, and she matched each number to a location in the time it took her heart to beat twice. North corridor, east service door, main atrium balcony, kitchen access. They had the building's 4 primary exit vectors covered. The coordinating voice said, cake ceremony 7:15, execute on audio cue. Signal is the first note of the cutting song. 7:15, her pushed timeline. She had moved it there herself, not knowing she had moved it directly into their adjusted window. They had compensated faster than she expected, which meant they had an inside source for the schedule changes. Someone in the venue's event staff. Someone who had received Marcus's updated timeline and fed it up a chain she couldn't see. She thought about Marcus. Eliminated him immediately. She had hired Marcus herself. She had known him for 4 years, she was certain, which meant someone else. One of the additional catering staff she'd brought in from New York, or one of the venue's house team who had been on the property before her 36-hour access window. It didn't matter now. The source didn't change the timeline. 7:15, the first note of the cutting song. She looked at her watch. 58 minutes. She was already moving. The ballroom doors opened at 5:30, and Marilyn stood at the entrance and watched 240 people flow into the most beautiful room she had ever built, and she felt something she very rarely felt during events. She felt the fragility of it. Not the logistics. Those were solid, those were hers, those held. The fragility was in the human fact of it. 240 people who had dressed for beauty tonight and driven to Buckhead and kissed the cheeks of people they knew and settled into their seats with champagne and the uncomplicated pleasure of a celebration. They did not know what Marilyn knew. They were, for the moment, entirely safe in the prison of their own ignorance, and she was the only thing standing between that ignorance and what was coming. She pressed her earpiece. "Marcus, yeah. I need you to do something, and I need you to do it without asking me why." A pause. "Marilyn, after dinner, before the first dance, I need you to locate the building's primary electrical panel, and I need you to know exactly how to cut the main circuit from that location, not the emergency lighting. That stays on. The main circuit only." A longer pause. "Marcus, the panel is in the basement mechanical room," he said quietly. "I walked it during setup. B1, northeast corner. There's a red lever, main disconnect. You flip it down and the building goes dark except for the emergency strips. How long to get there from the ballroom? Service stairs off the kitchen. Maybe 2 minutes. I need you to be at that panel at 7:12. Silence. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to trust me." She heard him breathe. She had worked with him for 4 years, and she had never once asked him to trust her, because trust had never been a variable she required of the people in her orbit. She required competence. She required reliability. Trust was something else, something warmer and less efficient and considerably more dangerous. He said, 7:12. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she had meant anything she'd said all day. The first dance was announced at 6:47. The band leader, a man Marilyn had hired from a very good Atlanta jazz ensemble, stepped to the microphone with the warm authority of someone who understood that his job was to make a room feel like a single breathing thing. And he said the names, and the guests turned, and So-yeon led Ji-ho to the center of the floor. The song was something slow and classic and beautiful, and the ballroom's lighting shifted to a warm amber wash that Marilyn had programmed for exactly this moment, and So-yeon placed one hand at Ji-ho's waist and took her other hand in his, and they began to move. He was a precise dancer. She had not expected that, though she should have. Everything he did was precise. He moved Ji-ho through the choreography with the same controlled efficiency he brought to everything, and Ji-ho matched him. And from the outside, it looked like two people who had rehearsed for the moment their lives were beginning together. Marilyn stood in the wings. She watched Ji-ho's hands. Specifically, she watched Ji-ho's left hand, which held a bridal bouquet. White peonies and garden roses, sourced personally, arranged by a florist Marilyn had trusted for 6 years. It was a beautiful bouquet. It was full and dense, and its structural wiring could, if you built it correctly, conceal something in its center that had nothing to do with flowers. She had been thinking about this since So-yeon mentioned the cake cutting, since she understood that Ji-ho was not an unwitting instrument, but an active one. Since she recalibrated everything she thought she knew about the woman on the dance floor, the bouquet. She noted it, filed it, kept it close. The first dance ended, and the applause rose through the ballroom, and So-yeon stepped back from Ji-ho, and the band leader invited the guests to join, and the floor began to fill. And in the new configuration of movement and bodies and music, Marilyn watched So-yeon say something to one of his groomsmen, low, brief, a single instruction, and then turn from the floor. His eyes found her immediately. He crossed the room toward a point near the east wall, and she moved from the wing to intercept him at the corridor entrance. And as they passed each other, she said very quietly, "Supply closet, 50 feet down the left corridor," and kept walking. She was already inside it when he arrived 40 seconds later. It was a narrow room, shelving on both sides, linens and glassware spares, on the ambient hum of the building's climate system through the wall. a single overhead bulb on a pull chain that she had left off. In the dark, she could feel the confined space of it and the contained intensity of the man who had just filled the remaining 3 feet. "I've confirmed the positions," she said, keeping her voice below the level of the music still audible through the wall. 4 of them. North corridor, east service door, balcony, kitchen access. They have all 4 primary exit vectors. Secondary egress? His voice was low and close and utterly level. Service elevator. North face connects through the kitchen to the loading dock. I have 3 vehicles staged there in... She checked her watch in the dark. 22 minutes. My logistics contact, he's reliable. My men? 8 groomsmen. I need you to move them to positions adjacent to the ballroom exits before 7:12. Not obviously, staggered, one at a time over the next 20 minutes, each one making a natural exit from the dance floor. I need them in the service corridor behind the kitchen by 7:10. A pause. She could feel him thinking. Not hesitating, So-yeon didn't hesitate, but processing with the rapid specificity of someone who had made contingency decisions under pressure many times before. "The bride," he said. "The bouquet," she said. "I don't think it's only flowers." A silence. "She's not walking out of that ballroom with it," he said. It wasn't a question. "No, but the timing matters. If we move before the signal, they execute early. We need them to stay on their own schedule until the moment we break it." She steadied her voice. "Yes, at 7:12, my site manager kills the main circuit. The ballroom goes dark. Emergency lighting only. I know where every strip is. I installed the specifications. In the dark, with 240 people in motion, your men move the primary guests to the service corridor. You follow me to the kitchen. We take the service elevator to the loading dock." The 4 positions. The north corridor position is between us and the kitchen. That's the problem. She had been turning this for the last hour. It's 1 person, stationed at the kitchen access point. She paused. "I need one of your men on that position before the lights go out. Quietly. No disruption to the room." She felt, rather than saw, the small shift in his posture that indicated agreement. "The guests," he said. "Yas, 240 people in a dark ballroom. Emergency lighting activates automatically on the main disconnect. The room won't be blind. It'll be dim and disorienting. The band will stop. People will be confused but not panicked. And in the first 90 seconds of that confusion, your men will have already moved the people who matter to safety." She paused. "The others, they don't know what's happening. Confusion reads as a power failure. They'll move toward the exits on their own. The building is not a danger to them. Unless the 4 positions decide to stop being patient. They won't. Not immediately. Their protocol is a scheduled execution on an audio cue. A power failure before that cue is an anomaly, not a trigger. It disrupts their coordination before they're ready to act. They'll spend the first 2 minutes trying to re-establish communication with each other. That's our window." Silence in the dark, small room. 2 minutes, he said. 2 minutes, she agreed. "I've moved faster." Another silence. And then, unexpected, entirely outside the tight professional frequency they had maintained all day, a sound from him that was not quite a laugh, too quiet for that, too controlled, but something in its register that was almost human, almost warm, almost the sound of a man who had spent years inside a world that never surprised him finding himself unexpectedly surprised. "Ms. Flores," he said. "Marilyn," she said, and didn't know why. A pause. "Marilyn." He said it the same way he said everything, with full weight, like the word was a decision. "After tonight." "You said that already." "I'll say it again." She pulled the supply closet door open. The corridor light fell in across the floor between them. She looked at him. White tuxedo, black bow tie, tattooed hands loose at his sides, the contained stillness that she had spent all day reading as danger and was now reading as something more complicated. And she said, 7:12, don't be anywhere near the dance floor. She walked back toward the ballroom. The next 23 minutes were the longest of her professional life. She worked them the way she worked everything, systematically, invisibly, from the edges of the room. She watched So-yeon move through his reception with the seamless performance of a man who was not counting down the minutes to his own assassination attempt. She watched his groomsmen peel away from the room one by one. A trip to the bar, a phone call, a quiet word with a guest near the door, and not return. She watched Ji-ho at a table near the center of the room, the bouquet in her lap, her face still and serene and patient. She watched the kitchen access door at the ballroom's south end, and she watched it open at 7:04, and one of So-yeon's men, not a groomsman, one of the black suit contingent from the green room, step through it without being noticed by anyone except her. The north corridor position was addressed. At 7:09, she pressed her earpiece and said, "Marcus, I'm here. Where are you?" "Basement. Northeast corner. My hand is on the lever." She exhaled once. 3 minutes. Copy. She stood in the wing at 7:10 and she looked at the room she had built. The flowers at absolute peak, the candlelight steady and warm, the band playing something mid-tempo and lovely over the soft collisions of 240 people in conversation, in laughter, in the uncomplicated pleasure of a beautiful evening that none of them knew was about to end abruptly. The cake was on its table at the far end of the room, white fondant and hand sugar flowers that her pastry contact had delivered at noon, a piece of architecture as much as a confection, lit from below by a warm uplight she had positioned herself. The band leader was moving toward the microphone. She looked at her watch. 7:11:43. The band leader said, "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for one of our favorite wedding traditions." She pressed her earpiece. "Marcus, now." The room went dark. Not completely. The emergency strips activated in the same breath. Thin bands of cold white light at floor level along the walls and exit paths, painting the room in shadow and pale geometry. But the candles had gone out with the main circuit, the pendants and the uplights and the band's stage lighting all extinguished simultaneously, and in the sudden dimness, 240 people made a sound that was collective and involuntary, a gasp, a stir, the human sound of a room losing its bearings. The band stopped mid-sentence. Marilyn was already moving. She came out of the wing at a controlled walk, not running, not panicked, the visible event coordinator managing a visible power situation, and she moved along the east wall toward the south end of the room, her hand on the wall's surface, reading the building the way she always read it, from memory and from touch. Emergency strip at the baseboard. Service corridor entrance 14 feet ahead. Kitchen door 20 feet beyond that. Behind her, in the ballroom's dimness, she could hear the specific sounds of her plan in motion. The low, firm voices of So-yeon's men guiding people toward exits, professional and calm, the kind of voice that moves a crowd without alarming it. The sounds of chairs, of movement, of 240 people negotiating the dark with varying degrees of composure. She reached the kitchen door and pushed through it. The kitchen was dim, emergency strips only, the stainless steel surfaces catching the cold light in long, silver reflections. The catering staff had frozen in place when the power went, might the instinct of trained professionals in an uncertain situation, and Marilyn moved through them without stopping and said, "Power failure. We're working on it. Please stay in position," which was both false and true in the ways that mattered. She was 4 steps into the kitchen when the door behind her opened again. So-yeon came through it. He moved without urgency and without hesitation, the white tuxedo jacket catching the emergency light, his eyes adjusting to the dimness with the rapid, practiced speed of someone who had navigated difficult environments before. He crossed the kitchen toward her, and she turned and led, and he followed. And that was the arrangement that had crystallized in the supply closet and now simply was. She knew the building. He moved through the world she didn't, and between them they covered everything. She heard them before she saw them. 2 sets of footsteps in the service corridor to her left, not her contact's vehicles, not Marcus, not any variable she had placed. The The kitchen access position had been handled, but the east service door was 40 feet away, and someone had moved faster than she'd calculated, had abandoned their post when the power dropped instead of trying to re-establish communication, had decided to act without the audio cue. She caught So-yeon's arm in the dark, stopped him. She pointed left, 2 fingers, then the wall. He read it in a breath and moved to the right side of the corridor entrance, and she moved to the left, and they stood in the dark kitchen pressed against the wall, and the footsteps grew, and she thought, with the strange clarity that arrives only in moments of total adrenaline, "I have spent 6 years making sure I was never in a room like this." The footsteps stopped. A voice, low and clipped, a single word in a language she didn't speak. A pause. Then one of So-yeon's men came through the north corridor entrance behind them, and the next 15 seconds were sounds she didn't look at and didn't catalog and didn't file, because some things were not variables and not logistics, and she was not equipped for them, and she had always known that, and it was fine. Then it was quiet. "Service elevator," she said. "Yes," So-yeon said. The elevator was at the kitchen's northwest corner, behind a set of double doors she had noted on her first walkthrough and had opened once to confirm the mechanism worked. A freight elevator, wide enough for a pallet of supplies or, as it turned out, 2 people moving with controlled urgency toward a loading dock. She pressed the B1 button. The elevator moved. In the enclosed space, descending, she became aware of several things simultaneously, that her hands were steady, which surprised her, that the controlled stillness she'd built her entire professional life on was still intact, which didn't, and that So-yeon was standing close enough in the narrow elevator that she could feel the warmth of the white jacket at her shoulder. She stared at the floor numbers. "The bouquet," he said. "Someone will find it," she said. "The ballroom is going to have more pressing concerns in the next 10 minutes. "Jiho," she turned her head slightly. "She was placed," he said. Not explaining. Processing, confirming something out loud, the way people sometimes need to say a true thing in order to fully inhabit it. The marriage was the mechanism, the peace treaty was theater. He paused. "I was meant to lower my defenses for one ceremony and one night, and trust that the arrangement held." "Did you?" A silence. The elevator reached B1. The doors opened onto the basement corridor. Concrete walls, fluorescent emergency lighting, the ambient mechanical hum of the building's systems. "I trusted the planner," he said. She stepped out of the elevator. The loading dock was on the building's north face, accessible from B1 through a freight corridor that ran the length of the basement. She had walked it twice in 36 hours. She walked it now with So-yeon behind her, and her hand trailing the wall and the emergency strips at their feet, casting long, pale shadows ahead of them. And at the end of it was the dock's interior door, and through it was cold March air and the low idle of 3 vehicles, and a man she had called 40 minutes ago, standing at the dock's edge with his hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything when they came through the door. He looked at her, then at So-yeon, then back at her, and he pointed at the middle vehicle. She heard the dock door behind her open again, and turned to find 7 of So-yeon's men filing through it in the same contained, disciplined way they did everything. The groomsmen from the reception had moved through the service corridor and down through the building on a separate route she had given them through the earpiece 10 minutes ago, each one accounted for. She counted them automatically, 7, plus So-yeon, plus herself. She got in the middle vehicle. The safe house was 35 minutes outside the city, a property she had never seen before tonight, navigated to via a route given to her by the man in the middle vehicle's passenger seat, who made 2 phone calls in low Korean and then said nothing for the remainder of the drive. She sat in the back with So-yeon, and the city fell away outside the window, and the adrenaline did the thing that adrenaline always did when the immediate crisis resolved. It began, slowly and without announcement, to leave. She felt it going. The specific sharpening of the last 6 hours, the way the world had narrowed to logistics and variables and live decisions, the way her mind had run at a frequency she didn't have a name for, the way her body had simply performed without consulting her emotions because her emotions had not been a relevant variable, All of it began to soften at the edges, and in the space it left behind was something she was considerably less practiced at. She looked out the window. She had no clipboard. She had left it in the ballroom in the dark. She had no tablet, no event schedule, no timeline to manage. She had her earpiece, but there was no one in it except the faint last traces of the frequency she'd been monitoring all day, which had gone silent the moment the building lost power. She had her black blazer and her white button-down and her professional bun, which had maintained its architecture through the entire evening with the same stubborn efficiency she had applied to everything else. She was, for the first time in longer than she could measure, completely without a task. It was an unfamiliar sensation. She was not entirely certain she liked it. The safe house was a converted farmhouse, wide and low and surrounded by dark land, lit from within with the warm amber of old fixtures and furnished in the spare, functional way of a space maintained for utility rather than comfort. Someone had been here recently enough to have set a fire in the main room's hearth. Logs burning low but steadily, the room holding a warmth that met them at the door. So So-yeon's men dispersed through the house with the practiced efficiency of people who had used it before, checks and clearances she didn't need to manage. She stood in the main room and watched the fire, and she heard So-yeon say something to the last of his men, a word and a small gesture toward the rest of the house, and then it was quiet. He came to stand at the far end of the room. He had removed the white tuxedo jacket somewhere between the vehicle and the door and stood now in the white dress shirt and black bow tie, his tattooed arms and hands visible from the rolled cuffs, the neck tattoos unobscured, everything that the jacket had framed now present without ceremony. He looked, she thought, more himself this way, less constructed. He found a bottle on the sideboard and 2 glasses and carried them to the low table by the fire without asking and poured and set one glass down and held the other. She came to the chair across from the fire. She sat down and picked up the glass. The drink was something amber and warm, and she didn't ask what it was, and he didn't tell her, and they sat in the quiet of the fire for a moment that had no logistics in it. "You changed the timeline," he said. "I moved the cake ceremony. 30 minutes. She swirled the glass. "They adjusted within the hour. They had someone in the event staff." "Yes. I didn't find out who." "I know who," he said simply. She looked at him. "I had suspicions before tonight," he said. "Not confirmed. Now confirmed." He took a drink. "It won't be a problem." She didn't ask what that meant. Some things were not her variables. She was learning slowly to let that be true without needing to manage it. "Your plan," he said. "The circuit break, the vehicles." "Standard contingency thinking," she said. He looked at her steadily across the firelight. "You planned an extraction from a hostile venue in under 4 hours with no security background, no weapons, and a site manager. Marcus is very good. You knew the building's entire electrical system. I always know the building. You intercepted an active radio frequency through an event coordination earpiece. The frequency bled," she said. "I got lucky." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been telling me all evening what you were paid for," he said. "You keep making it small. Why?" She thought about that. She looked at the fire and she thought about 6 years of making herself small inside her own extraordinary competence, of building walls around the parts of herself that felt too much and leaning into the parts that performed without feeling. And she thought about the moment in the bridal suite when she had looked at that red light blinking in the mirror and stood at the window for 45 seconds and then done the thing she was not paid for and could not explain. "Habit," she said. He nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood. "I had a rule," she said. "Mind the flowers," he said. She looked at him sharply, a quiet shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something in its family. "You said it this morning. You were adjusting a floral crate delivery when I arrived. I heard you say it to your site manager." He took another drink. "I thought it was a curious thing for a woman with your eyes to say." "My eyes." "You see everything." He said it plainly, without flattery, as simple observation. "From the moment you walked into my green room this morning, You had already read every person in that room, measured every risk, catalogued every exit. You saw the transmitter in a mirror at 20 feet while performing a professional task. You intercepted a radio signal through a tool built for something else entirely. He paused. A woman like that does not succeed by minding flowers. She was quiet. You built a rule, he said, to keep yourself at the edge of your own life. The fire settled, a log shifting with a soft collapse of sound, and the amber light moved across the room and across his face, and she looked at him directly for the first time since the supply closet, and found that what she saw there was what she had been avoiding looking at all day. Not the mafia boss, not the fearsome client, not the variable requiring careful management. A man sitting without his armor on in the light of a fire, holding a glass, telling her a true thing without any particular agenda. She had been looked at many times in her life. She could not recall being seen. "I didn't save you for the paycheck," she said. She had not planned to say it. It arrived the way true things sometimes arrived, without being invited, without being strategic. He was still. The particular stillness of someone who has received something unexpected and is holding it carefully. "I know," he said. The fire. The amber light. The quiet house around them, his men elsewhere, the city 35 minutes away with all its smoke and wreckage and complications that would begin requiring management in the morning. She knew that. She was already, in the back of the part of her mind that never fully stopped, beginning to see the shape of what came next, the logistics of the aftermath, the variables, the new configuration of her life that tonight had produced. But that was morning. He reached across the low table and poured a second measure into her glass without asking, and set the bottle down, and she looked at his hand as he did it. The intricate tattoos, the rings, the particular stillness with which he did everything, and she thought about how she had reached for those same lapels 12 hours ago to perform the fiction of adjusting a boutonniere, and had instead changed her life, and his, and whatever came after. "After tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were going to discuss terms." "I was." He settled back. The bow tie was loosened now, she noticed, the first imperfection in his appearance all day. She found it, to her own considerable surprise, disarming. "The terms are simple. They usually are," she said. "It's the details that complicate things." "Yes." And this time the corner of his mouth went all the way. Not a controlled acknowledgement, not a professional concession, a real thing, brief and unhurried, indeed changing his face into something she had not seen on him before and would not have predicted. "In my experience, the details are where everything interesting happens." She looked at him over her glass. "I have a rule," she said, "about getting involved." "You broke it at 1:47 this afternoon," he said. "I know. How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly, about the 45 seconds at the bridal suite window, about the supply closet in the dark and the freight elevator and the basement corridor and the cold March air at the loading dock and sitting now in a farmhouse 35 minutes from the city with a fire and a glass and a man who had just told her she built a rule to keep herself at the edge of her own life. "Inconvenient," she said. He laughed. A real one. Quiet. But real. The sound of something long held finally released, filling the warm room for one unguarded moment before it settled back into the fire's soft crackle. She watched it happen and felt, somewhere behind the professional walls and the careful distance and the habit of making herself small, something she had not felt in a very long time. She picked up her glass. "Tell me the terms," she said. He looked at her across the firelight, completely, thoroughly, missing nothing, and he began to speak, and outside the dark land held the farmhouse, and inside the fire burned steadily, and the night moved toward morning. And Marilyn Flores, who had spent 6 years surviving by seeing everything and saying nothing, sat in the warm light of a new reality she had built with her own hands and decided, so for the first time in longer than she could name, that she had no interest in being at the edge of anything anymore.